Peha with TableTalk Northwest. I'm here talking with Master Distiller Dr. Bill Lumsden from Glenmorangie Distillery in Scotland. What a treat it is. Welcome to Seattle.
Thank you very much, Jamie. My pleasure to be here.
You know, I want to say Glenmorangie. Why do I want to do that?
Most people would naturally say that, but the correct pronunciation in Scottish English is Glenmorangie. So we say it rhymes with the fruit orange.
Glenmorangie.
And that's one of the reasons why a lot of our corporate colours are orange.
Right, I got that. Makes sense.
Yeah. I wear an orange suit when I'm in the office back in Scotland.
Okay. So Master Distiller is the title that is easy for me to say, but I understand that you have a much longer title. Could you share that with me?
Yeah, my proper job title, the one that's on my A4 size business card, is I'm Director of Distilling, Whisky Creation and Whisky Stocks.
My goodness.
So I guess in a nutshell it means that I'm responsible for the liquid in our bottles.
Okay. So I'm curious, you know, I've actually been to the distillery. I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago to go on a cruise and went to Scotland. Really did not know what to expect once I got there. Fell in love with the country. It's a beautiful country. Clean, the water, everything's so beautiful. And was able to visit the distillery and taste through some of the whiskeys at that time and look at the barrel program, which of course is so interesting. And that's kind of what we're talking about today in this new limited release that's coming out.
I guess your cruise went into Invergordon.
We actually drove there. I think we went to, we took a couple of the main cities there and, hired a van and drove around, and it's such a beautiful country. My goodness.
It's nice that you've been able to visit the distillery because it'll help bring some of the things we'll talk about to life today.
Exactly. Well, first of all, the history. The distillery has been around for a long time, since the 1800s, I think.
1843 the distillery was established.
Right.
And it was independently owned up until 1920, and then a well-known Edinburgh company of blenders and bottlers bought it, primarily to use in its blends. But in the late 1950s, 1960s, there was a bit of a sea change in the industry, and people started to realise that single malts were so good that they should be bottled on their own again.
Well, and one of the things that I'd like to do, I was on a cruise, so I wasn't there for very long. We didn't stop anywhere very long. But what I did notice was how fun it would be to go on a tour of all the distilleries in Scotland. You could make quite a trip out of that, maybe a couple of trips. There's quite a few.
It would take you a long time because currently there's 108 malt distilleries operating in the small country of Scotland.
Right, okay, that's a lot.
I've visited most of them, not all of them.
Well, and there's a difference. This is a Highland.
It is, yeah.
Right, okay.
This is a Northern Highland malt, but these they're just really geographical distinctions.
Right.
So there's Highland, there's Lowland, there's Islay, there's Campbelltown, and then perhaps the most well-known region for malt whisky, Speyside, is technically part of the Highland region. But it's really more to do with what goes on at the distillery that determines the characteristics of the whisky.
So once we get down to talking about the particular casks and how things are made and all of the research that you do, the wood research that you do, is it what makes this product so special? How much does the water have to do with it?
I would say that as a scientist, every stage of the production process has a contributory factor to it. But if you consider the final flavour overall as if you imagine a pie chart with 100%, the barrels, in my opinion, contribute at least 60% to that. So it's one of the most important parts. And I would say that ordinarily the water maybe is not so important. However, at Glenmorangie, and I'm not sure if you were taken to our spring, we've got our own private spring called the Turlogie Spring, and it's very unusual water for Scotland because it's very hard, very high in dissolved mineral salts. The consequence of that is we have a very vigorous, powerful, quick fermentation, and that's when all your fruity and floral flavours are produced. So my theory is, it's difficult to prove exactly, my theory is our mineral-rich water contributes to the fruitiness of Glenmorangie.
Okay, very good, thank you, that's great. Even I understand it, that's fantastic. So tell me a little bit, as we're talking about the history, before we work up to this recent release that we're going to taste, I'm excited about, and talk about, tell me a little bit about, as Glenmorangie was growing, what the decisions were to move into these special casks that you're now using.
Yeah, the history goes back into the 1960s and 1970s, which was a little bit before I joined the company at the end of 1994. And I think what primarily drove the decisions was that in these days there was only the 10-year-old and the 18-year-old, and it was such a delicious whiskey that the company, and it was a former managing director called Neil McCarroll, who's very elderly now, and I still keep in touch with him because he was a great inspiration to me. But he decided that he wanted to try and offer our loyal consumers a wider range of products. So they started experimenting with different wine barrels, and it quickly became apparent that because the Glenmorangie spirit is so delicate, a full maturation in, for example, sherry wasn't right. It overwhelmed the finesse of the whiskey. So the company developed the concept that we call wood finishing or extra maturation. And when I joined the company, that had all kind of fallen into abeyance a little bit, and I was given virtually a free rein to resurrect this and take it to the next level. And so I've learned an awful lot there, and we've brought many, many delicious and exciting expressions of Glenmorangie to the market. And of course it's a technique now that's much copied within the industry.
You've traveled a lot. I know Spain is involved here, probably Italy, I think, as I was reading back on some of the private brands that you've released, some Super Tuscan oak barrels, that you've used that as well. And so what are we talking about here? The one that has just recently been released, this is the Companta.
The Companta, yeah. The strategy and my target with the private edition is to bring out a new limited Glenmorangie each year. Obviously, it has to be a whiskey that's delicious enough to bear the Glenmorangie name, and I want each of them to be different from the one before. So for some of them I use different wine barrels, for others I'm looking at other aspects of the production process. So Companta is number 5 in the range, and that kind of had its genesis back in 2008 when I visited the wonderful region of Burgundy in France for the first time. And as I always say to people, I was there for 4 days. Half a day was business, and the remaining 3.5 days were pure unadulterated pleasure as I went round some of the great vineyards of that region.
You must have tasted some amazing wines.
Oh, I absolutely did. And again, I got into big trouble when I got home. I hammered my credit card, as you can imagine.
Did you bring some wine home with you, I hope?
1 or 2 bottles.
Okay.
I actually had to get it separately shipped home. I bought so much. But anyway, so I met the head winemaker of a real cult vineyard in Burgundy near Moray Saint-Denis called Clos de Tart. And it's one of the 5 Grand Cru monopoles of Burgundy. And to be honest, I had only just heard of it before. So I visited the vineyard, fell in love with it, had lunch with the head winemaker, Monsieur Pitio, and managed to persuade him to sell me his barrels from the 2007 harvest. And I filled some 1999 Glenmorangie whiskey from bourbon barrels into that in 2008 and left it there for 5 years. And that's what started the product that became Companta off.
And Companta is Gaelic for?
It's Gaelic for friendship. And it's a play on the old alliance between Scotland and France, which goes back many centuries, when France and Scotland joined forces, basically to fight the English.
Oh, interesting. So it has many layers.
There's
Just
many
like
layers
in its flavor,
to it.
it has many layers. It's interesting as well. And I know you're making this in a limited quantity. So when we say limited quantity, what does that mean?
Limited means that there will only be a few thousand 9-litre, 12 bottle cases of it. And again, it's part of the whole buzz about this. We want to generate a bit of excitement, and it will sell out. It's almost sold out already, and it was only launched in the United States last week.
That's right. Well, that's a quick trip for you. Well, I'm delighted that I'm able to taste it. When I was at the distillery, I was able to taste, I think your basic 4.
Yeah.
And we were able to visit and see the different barrels that were there. And maybe you could take a minute and talk about some of those different barrel treatments with even the 4 prior private ones that you have.
The way I make Glenmorangie is the spirit is always matured in American white oak ex-bourbon barrels, because there's a fabulous synergy between Kentucky and Tennessee and Scotland. Our cousins in Kentucky, new charred oak barrel used only once. We prefer it to have a filling once beforehand to take some of the...
mellow it out a little bit.
Exactly. So all Glenmorangie is matured in these barrels beforehand, and then I will transfer it into different barrels for a limited period. So the one our original, the entry level one, is exclusively in bourbon barrels, and then something else. So
Towards the very end. Okay.
So the first one of the private edition, which was called Sonalta PX, 10 years roughly in bourbon barrels, and then about 2 years in giant Spanish oak sherry butts that had contained rich, sweet, sticky Pedro Jimenez wine. So that surprised me about how popular it was.
Leaves a little sweetness to the
a lot
whiskey?
of sweetness and spiciness. I get a lot of people asking me
I
if
remember
I can...
tasting
yeah,
that.
It might
That
have been
one
out.
really stood out.
Yeah,
Yes.
we've sold out completely now of that. Number 2 was called Finalta, and that was my interpretation of how I imagined Glenmorangie would have tasted 100 years or so ago.
okay.
So I used some batches of medium peated Glenmorangie because the whiskies would have been smokier in these days.
Right.
Number 3 was the end of a 10-year search to get hold of wine casks from the mighty Super Tuscan vineyard of Sassicaia.
Right.
So that was Artane. And then last year's one, which was the most surprising of all, was called Ilanta. And that was matured wholly in new virgin toasted oak barrels, so barrels that had never had bourbon in them. And it was 19 years old. And it won many accolades, including Jim Murray Whiskey Bible World Whiskey of the Year. So, in some respects, these four are a hard act to follow.
I was going to say, really, well, I'm very excited to try this.